Welcome. For me, it's a pleasure to be here again with you with another event of the Explorers. Today we have a very interesting and a special guest. We have with us Amy Wright. She's going to talk about teaching history through comic books, opportunities for public and visual history. I will introduce Amy and then I will give her the floor, and then perhaps we can ask her some questions and have a discussion. Amy Wright is a public history PhD candidate at Carleton University, Ottawa, investigating the 1950s anti-comics campaign through a transnational lens, exposing its impact on the pedagogy of reading, perceptions of child health, and the normalization of certain forms of censorship. Amy is the course creator and instructor for graphic history, history through comic books, taught at Carleton as a public history class for undergraduate, and she's also the co-editor with Christine Gunderman of a forthcoming inaugural issue of International Public History to focus on graphic history as historical pedagogy and practice. Amy is also a librarian and the former manager of school outreach at the New York Public Library, where she first started partnering with history teachers and school librarians in New York City to incorporate graphic novels into from kindergarten to 12th grade classroom instruction and libraries. So thank you, Amy, very much for being here and for accepting our invitation from the Explorers.
Awesome. Thank you, Jimena, for organizing these discussions. I think it's really nice to have this space to talk, and this will be a conversation. So this will be the first time that I'm talking about the course that I just taught in the fall. So it was a course that I had created as part of my PhD coursework leading into my candidacy exams. And it just happened for the first time this fall. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some student feedback that came from the course, and also how the course made me start to think about teaching public history differently. As I said to the students who taught the class, I would love if they came out of the class having an appreciation for comics, because I love comics, but that really wasn't the course goal. The course goal was very much to think about public history and especially visual history differently, and think about some transferable framework for visual analysis that we can all employ in different facets of public history, whether it's curating a museum, working with photographs, working with other elements of popular culture. So I'm going to get started. Before I start, I'm just going to share my screen and I'll show you the course site. So the course site is, okay. The course site, even if you just Google Carleton University History Through Comic Books, maybe actually I will drop the link into the chat is what I will do. So you can see, it tells you a little bit about the class. We're going to offer it again this fall. It's pretty exciting that for a public history class, because we now offer at Carleton, we have a public history concentration for a BA, we have a master's program, and I am of the first cohort of public history PhDs in Canada. So yeah, we don't, at a PhD level, it's not as much, but we've just started with the BA and now the PhD. So this is the class that is offered at the BA concentration level. And we're really excited. We had a full course and actually had folks waitlisted for this in the fall. Just going to pull up my slides and we will get started. And as I'm talking, I don't mind, Jimena, if folks have questions. You can even cut in with the audio. I find sometimes, because I just have a single screen when I'm presenting with a PowerPoint. So if you do need to cut in, just no worries, just let me know via audio, and I'm happy to answer questions as I go too.
Also, if people prefer not to talk, sometimes they find easier to post questions in the chat. That's also an option. I can read them, or Amy can also read them. So just feel free to just jump in whenever you want. Thank you. Thank you for that, Amy.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we are talking about opportunities for visual and public history. So a little bit about me. I am a PhD candidate, so I'm in my third year now, hopefully done next year or the following year. So I'm currently finishing up my research and starting to write my dissertation now. I am in Ottawa in Eastern Canada, so capital city of Canada. And a lot of my research takes place at Library and Archives Canada, considered the National Library and Archives Repository for Canada. So a lot of my research very much focuses on censorship of comic books in the 1950s, looking at it from a Canadian perspective. But a lot of my pedagogical focus is also looking at how we use comics and other elements of visual history in the classroom going forward, teaching history, especially for an undergrad and even graduate level. I am known though for my library work. I am a comics librarian. I'm one of the very first. We actually do have a comics librarian specialty now. And for almost 10 years, myself and other colleagues have partnered with organizations, including New York Comic Con, San Diego Comic Con, in Canada, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, to offer professional development around working with comic books for schools and libraries. And then academically, I'm very much known for my work with censorship. So these are actual archival documents from some of my work in the archives. There's a lot of fear, we would call it a moral panic, around comic books in the 1950s. And my research in the 1950s has become quite relevant. As folks may have seen, we are now experiencing levels of censorship of children's reading that haven't been seen since the 1950s. So we're currently experiencing an astronomical spike of suppression of children's reading materials, especially comics and especially titles by queer creators and BIPOC creators. A lot of states in the US have legislation, but it's not limited to the US. We're seeing a lot of censorship of reading material in Canada too, and I know from colleagues elsewhere that it's happening all over. But on a happier topic, how do we teach history and why would we teach history with comic books? So first, I just want to sort of unpack the term graphic history for folks maybe who haven't heard it or maybe have heard it and put it in a larger conversation. So when we're talking about teaching history with comics, comic studies is in itself an interdisciplinary field that has been around for about 10 to 20 years. A lot of folks in comic studies are coming from literary studies and media studies background. So a lot of my research is inherently interdisciplinary. So I'm using a lot of historical research and historical approaches and also comic studies in that more interdisciplinary lens. But very importantly, I am coming at everything I do through a public history focus. I would say for me, one of the largest ways the public history focus has influenced my work is very much looking at the way that the past and the present are involved in our historical understandings. I particularly liked this graphic for public historian Marko Diemenkowski because it very much talks about how when we look at public history through a public history lens, the past and the present are in active dialogue with each other. It's not a flattened view of history or a flattened view of understanding the past. It very much talks about how that is mediated through individual narratives, collective narratives, and it very much is an ongoing conversation. And this for me is one of the best elements when we talk about using comics for history, because through art, past and the present can coexist on the same page. So when we talk about graphic history, we can talk about its origin story. Does anyone know whose origin story this is? I would say the clue, this is the original Peter Parker, the original Spider-Man's origin story. So in comics, we say origin story, basically how something came to be. But of course, that's usually more complicated than a single narrative. So if you've watched Into the Spider-Verse and that you know the story of Miles Morales, there are many origin stories and many spider people now. But in terms of graphic history, in terms of the historical literature, we can point to 2018, graphic history was added as official review section to the American Historical Review. So this is the journal published by the American Historical Association. I think it's worth pointing out this is 2018. So we have seen comics and graphic novels used in history classrooms for decades, but in terms of acceptance on a larger academic, scholarly, and pedagogical level, it's quite recent. Especially if we juxtapose things like the American Historical Association has been around since 1884. The Canadian Historical Association has been around since 1922. Even public history, so National Council on Public History, they're 1979. The International Federation for Public History, 2010. And graphic history, it's only coming up in the past little bit. We have some movements in Canada, for example, we have a graphic history collective with academics, comic creators, and other scholars who've been around since 2008. And they work a lot with labor history movements. And so there is a very large lineage in many areas, but in this case, they're really trying to expose use of graphic imagery and labor movements going back decades, if not more than a century plus, and also working to use graphic art as a way to talk about historical issues and current issues. We see movements of graphic history trying to make inroads in Canada in 2014. And then we see the graphic history reviews added to the American Historical Review in 2018. I should point out Trevor Gett's quote is very worth dwelling on. He says, modern graphic histories promise to deliver the happy union of creativity and historical inquiry. Yet problems abound in this marriage. Historians, unaccustomed to using visual forms to convey information, struggle to capitalize on the potentialities of the multimodal comic form and to let the images do the work. And so Gett's point here about historians and that sort of uncomfortableness or unfamiliarity in using visual imagery is very much where the idea for this course started from. Especially as I realize, so Trevor Getz publishes the Graphic History Reviews in late 2018. In 2020, so January 2020, at the American Historical Association, I appeared on, I did not realize at the time, one of the first graphic history sessions at the American Historical Association. And it led me to understand just how, if you will, novel still the idea of using graphic imagery or indeed visual history in general in historical inquiry still is. We do use visual images in a lot of our historical work, but there's not a lot of discussion of how we teach the pedagogy of actually critically examining visual images and to really appreciate visual images in art for the kind of information that they convey. And I wanted to point out, of course, the issue that I'm currently working on with my colleague Christine from University of Cologne will be the first issue in international public history to specifically focus on graphic history, and will be one of the first issues, as far as I'm aware, specifically to focus on graphic history. There's a lot of text on the screen, but I just want to point out in terms of our call for paper, one of the things we indicated, because when we were prepping this, a lot of people were like, I teach Maus. And we're like, okay, Maus is great. Maus also came out as a published volume in 1992. So that was quite a long time ago. And one of the things that overlooks is not only the huge number of titles that have been published since then, but the fact that focusing on a single volume tends to overlook the larger framework of graphic history and also how we teach visual history in general. So our focus for this upcoming issue is very much graphic history as pedagogy. We want to really look at comics as historical documents and significant modes of visual communication and expressions. So even as I was prepping this class, and something that I continually run into is people say, oh, we know graphic history, and there are many, and these are considered canonical titles, if you will, for a reason. Maus, of course, goes on to win the Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Prize is kind of wrings its hands because at that time they did not have a category for comics and graphic novels. Marjan Serapi's Complete Persepolis, again, another award-winning title, and Joe Sacco's work of comics journalism. However, there's a lot more than just these titles. These are, again, some other if you will, canonical titles that you might be familiar with. But one of the things when I was teaching my students, if we take those titles that I just showed you on the first two slides, that's all that it does. And there's a lot more titles that have been published. especially when we consider Mouse is published in 1992, Persepolis comes out in the early 2000s, published earlier in France in a serialized form, but most of these titles are more than 10 to 20 years old. So the goal for me in teaching this course was to talk about visual language of comics and visual history in general, but also fight what I call the empty shelf phenomenon. And one of the things I was struck by, I had encountered this article from two history teachers looking at how we teach history, especially in terms of genocide and mass violence. And it's more than 10 years old, their article, but even 10 years ago, they point out that Mouse should not be the only title you consider when talking, let's say, about the Holocaust or teaching about genocide and mass violence, that there are so many other titles that you could also look at. I just want to point out, we have John Lewis's March, which is taught in New York City schools and has been for more than 10 years. In Canada, we have a lot of Indigenous created graphic histories, including This Place, 150 Years Retold. So it's Canadian history retold from an Indigenous public history and comics creator perspective. It also has a corresponding podcast that was created by CBC, so the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. Also have a huge expansion in graphic history through graphic medicine. So this is the intersection of medicine and comics arts. A lot of graphic medicine is very much focused on chronicling and documenting frontline workers' experiences, especially through something like the COVID pandemic. So it is very much building on a history of, if you will, bibliotherapy, so that combination of art and medicine that has existed for quite a long time. And a lot of graphic medicine very much fills in the blanks for a lot of stories around public health, or also experiences such as forced migration, to which there are no traditional historical books on the shelf. And this is Escaping Wars and Waves, which is done as a partnership through comics journalism and Médecins Sans Frontières, so Doctors Without Borders, documenting stories of Syrian refugees. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. So one of the things in showing, I started the course, I showed my students all those slides to say to them, there's a lot more than maybe you think of when you think of comics and graphic novels. But I also wanted to talk to them, very importantly, about comics as historical documents. And they were like, what do you mean comics as historical documents? And I was like, oh, did you know that in the mid-1940s through 1950s, comics were actually the most popular reading material for children? So in the photograph on the left-hand side, scholars have put estimates of comic book reading for kids between 90 and 95%. So all kids everywhere, because it was also one of the most readily accessible, affordable things that students could purchase. A very also important sort of historical absence is these are soldiers in World War II reading a comic book. And a very sort of untalked about thing about World War II is that about 25% of all material sent to soldiers in the trenches were comic books, including Captain America. So this is the New York Times talking about shipments sent to soldiers in World War II. And it has titles including Captain Marvel, Captain America. So when we talk about historical depictions, especially our perceptions of the historical past, I don't know about you, but I've rarely watched a World War II movie or seen a World War II exhibition when soldiers are actually reading comic books. But if 25% of them were reading comic books, we know that as a documented fact. Also, comic books are a lot lighter than a book if you're putting that in your backpack. It just shows, if you will, a historical omission based on our perceptions of the past. And so that was definitely one thing I wanted students to be aware of, that even though they might consider comic books as marginal, especially when we're talking about the past in the 1940s and 50s, this was one of the most popular formats for reading, leisure, entertainment, period, across all readership. It's also important that comics are not only, let's say, with the graphic medicine community, but by comic creators themselves. They're important cultural documents to bear witness. There was a huge influx of comics that were created post 9/11 because New York is also one of the heart of comics and has been since the inception of the comic book industry. So when we talk about historical documents of lived experiences, these are really important visual documents to consider. And these are some of the comics that were produced post 9/11. So yeah, one of my largest goals was we need to fight the empty shelf. I didn't want any of the students to think that graphic history was just mouse. Even because we have the ubiquitous iceberg diagram, I thought to really nail the point home, people think it's just this. In fact, it's so many other titles. What we also are seeing, which is fantastic and very heartening, is we are seeing a huge influx of content that's created, again, writing to those gaps on the shelf. So we have a lot of Indigenous created content, especially being published here in Canada. One that I've also included is Our Work is Everywhere, which is an illustrated history of queer and trans resistance. So we are seeing more books come to which we don't necessarily have an abundance of traditional historical books on the shelf. So it's a great way to visually reclaim sections on the shelf for, you know, stories that do not have enough history written about them. I just want to say, as I'm talking, you may hear me use the phrase comics. It may not be the phrase that you all are most familiar with. They are the same thing. There's a lot of discussion around the term graphic novel. What most people are unaware of is a lot of comics creators moved to the use of graphic novel because there was actually legislation around comics. Here in Canada, for example, comics were actually added to the Canadian Criminal Code under the obscenity clause, and they were actually there until 2018. By rebranding something that had been vilified in the 1940s and 50s during the censorship stuff that I'm researching for my PhD, it was a way that people could rebrand a lot of the content. A lot of people also have a perception of the term graphic novel as being more serious in terms of content than, for example, superheroes. I'm here to show you that even superheroes have graphic novels. This is a Marvel graphic novel from 1982. So it is, when we say graphic novel, it is a collection of comic stories. An important thing to note is that a lot of comics that people believe were originally published as graphic novels were actually published in serial format. So this is Chester Brown's Louis Riel, but Art Spiegelman's Mouse was originally published as serials, so published as short stories. Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis was also originally serialized. So all of these phrases, what comics, graphic novels, bande dessinée, manga, manhwa, comics is an umbrella that a lot of comic scholars, including myself, choose to use because it is more inclusive and expansive, and very much talks about the idea of sequential art, to use Scott McCloud's phrase. So why study comics? Why are they important? Especially when we talk about history, building on the point that Trevor Getz made earlier and the graphic history reviews, I don't think images are talked about enough in history. There is sort of an ongoing joke that historians will slap a photo into something, but maybe not talk about the significance or the context of that particular image. I think one of the best arguments, though, is by Alison Bechdel, who you may know as the creator of Fun Home, but also importantly, the creator of the Bechdel test, looking at media and gender and critically examining depictions of gender in media. So Alison Bechdel, this is quoted in Hilary Schutz's Why Comics, talks about comics as a new way of ordering ideas. So this idea of sequencing being very important, that we are building different building blocks for storytelling. And indeed, if folks have background in film, what do you do when you're creating a film? You storyboard a film. When you're putting together a sitcom or anything, you're thinking about the different progression of ideas. Even as we're putting together a PowerPoint, we're thinking about that. So this idea of sequencing and actually thinking about the ordering, this is one of the best things that comics brings to a discussion of historical analysis that we don't really have a lot of. So when we think about it, again, as a new way of ordering ideas, a new way of thinking about things visually. Ben Saunders from University of Oregon has done a lot of work, especially looking at superhero comics, and talks about them similar to how I talked about 9/11 as cultural documents of a particular time period. He talks especially about Superman and how to really contextualize Superman and understand Superman, you end up talking about the Great Depression. You end up talking about wealth inequity and why Superman is sort of always fighting against villains with too much money in their pockets and not enough that they're actually spreading around. But especially for my course, I really wanted to talk to the students very pragmatically about why we should study comics in a way that is historically relevant, which is historians don't tend to do enough of it. So we have graphic history reviews that were introduced into the American Historical Review in 2018. However, this is a review of the reviews in 2020, and Neil Mayer found that even in reviews of graphic history, most people weren't still talking about the art. So even when we have a focus to include more graphic text, we're still not analyzing the art or really talking about what purpose the art plays. So this was very much the jumping off point for the course and a lot of my research in terms of how we talk about visual language in public history classrooms. One thing I think to point out, again, within academic spaces that I don't think we do enough of, in K-12 classrooms, there is a lot of discussion of what is called multimodal learning. So this idea of having visual, auditory, reading, writing elements and kinesthetic elements. I don't think that's something we talk about enough in undergrad or graduate classrooms. Ideal classrooms should try to incorporate multimodal learning. Not only are you ensuring that you're meeting people where they're at in terms of their preferred learning style, it's a more effective way of teaching. The message tends to be better received if we're able to incorporate multimodal formats into the classroom. One of the best things about comics is that they are inherently multimodal. So all comics have visual elements, and they also have the elements of reading, writing, so those textual elements. This is one of, I think, the best arguments. A very important one is also simply that there has been a lot of hand-wringing around misinformation, students being inundated by visual imagery, and why wouldn't we incorporate a framework for students to critically analyze visual imagery and really think critically about the images and text that they're encountering in a day-to-day basis. So this was my thought in teaching the class was, I don't just want to teach students maybe more titles in comics. I really want to introduce the idea of critically decoding comics and thinking about those transferable skills for visual inquiry that they can take into other elements of public history. So one thing we did in the class that was maybe a little bit unusual for a historical classroom is one of their required textbooks was Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. One thing that occurred to me as I was teaching the class, having done a lot of presentations like this for more than 10 years, was a lot of times people might not have the vocabulary to start from to talk about visual imagery, to talk about the impacts of things like icons, color choices, perspective, point of view. So Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics is one of, within comic studies, considered a very pivotal text. Though it was published in the early 1990s, it very much breaks down the different elements of comics, talking especially about sequencing and how comic panels come together. So this was a particular section on icons we talked about. And it was very much the beginning of the course. We talked about, hey, there's a lot more titles than you're aware of, but also let's start to look for this visual vocabulary of comics. Let's start to talk about things like icons, color choices, and start to be aware of that in our day-to-day surroundings. So we talked a lot about Scott McCloud with icons, and again, trying to build up that visual fluency to start to pay attention to these in our day-to-day lives. And also pay attention to this idea of sequencing. So one of the things that comics does very well, and again, it's a very transferable thing to any element of visual history, is when we start to pay attention to what is included and what is left out, what is featured and what is not featured. How is the sequence built? What kind of narration, sort of implied narration, do those icons together teach us? Just gonna jump ahead. So one of the ways that we talked about this to students was learning to recognize, we called it graphic history in the wild. So trying to find examples in day-to-day lives that they thought were graphic history, maybe things that we hadn't encountered or hadn't thought about. And as a way to kick things off, I introduced some of my favorite examples, which are when you get on an airplane, how do they teach you what to do for safety? And people are like, that's not a comic. And I was like, what is it? So we have heavy use of icons here. There's strategic use of color. For example, in the For Your Safety on the left-hand side, we have everything highlighted in green is something that is considered good. Everything that is highlighted in red is like, no, don't do that. And we have a line through that icon. We also have, very importantly, use of sequencing. So the images are put together in a particular order to teach us a particular thing. And then the students were tasked with trying to find graphic history themselves in the wild. So these are some of the examples that they found. A map, of course. So this was a map of Carleton, and we can see different directional things. And one of the things the student who had chosen this wanted to point out is there's interesting choices here in terms of perspective, because we have the buildings, for example, we have the buildings drawn in such a way so that we know this is a really tall building, this is a shorter building, this is maybe a single story building. So there's a lot of visual information included in this map of the university campus that maybe if we don't take a minute and pause and sort of try to decode it, we would sort of overlook. We would take that information in though, but it's a matter of sort of pausing and slowing down and thinking about what elements do we want to point out and sort of decode in that particular image. Another example, very important, IKEA instructions. So especially like, I mean, and the joke is sometimes IKEA instructions, right? But I do think it's important to sort of pull out the elements. So especially sequencing is very important in IKEA. And this is sometimes maybe why the IKEA furniture doesn't come together well. We don't follow the sequencing. But one of the discussions we had in class was, okay, how is sequencing relayed in this particular set of instructions? And we have the numbers that tell us, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. One of the other things that they're doing in the instructions that's very important is they're making use of close-ups. So you can see the close-up. So we have where the screws are coming together and they have a close-up to say this is actually what this looks like. So again, these are visual choices and visual elements that are being added that are worth thinking about and sort of being like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. They're doing close-ups here because they want to make this information very apparent. Another example, very important example. We had a lot of these come out during, especially the beginning of COVID. This is an infographic on children wearing fabric masks. So this was from the beginning. I think this one was maybe summer 2020, but many, many hand washing comics. And again, like with the airline, I would call this a comic because we have multiple sequences of visual information told in a particular sequence that narrates something. If, for example, we change the order on hand washing, it would be a very different information. So these are some of the ones that students have found in class, and we spent a lot of time talking about. So When students found these as part of their assignment for that week, they were encouraged to just give a few lines about why did they particularly choose this example, what were some things that they were struck by, and also what were some new questions that they started to ask about these visual images from maybe before the class and now midway through the class. What were some of the new questions they were asking? So our next step in class, so we have the first step of just sort of general awareness that there's a lot more comics going on out there. Graphic history is much larger, and really starting to look for that graphic history in our everyday lives. The next step was taking a lot of what we had talked about with Scott McLeod and also walking through some examples from graphic history in the wild. Was very much trying to, okay, let's put these skills into place and let's learn how to decode certain examples. So this is again from Scott McLeod, and he talks about this idea of pictures being received information. We need no formal education to get the message. The message is instantaneous. So this is again something that with visual information, we're generally not sort of pausing and saying, what is that received information? What information are people getting from a visual image? When in fact, writing is what he calls perceived information. It takes time and specialized knowledge to decode the abstract language, abstract symbols of language. So we give a lot of time to deconstructing and decoding writing. We don't give a lot of time to on the left with visual imagery. And so this was very much trying to interject that pause for students. So on the left, we have a political cartoon published in Punch magazine. So this is in the late 19th century. For those of you who aren't aware, Punch magazine, hugely popular magazine throughout the former British Empire. It was a very popular magazine. I'm not going to defend the content because Punch had a lot of scenes of colonialism that weren't awesome. And this is also an important point, is that this is magazine that was circulated throughout the British Empire. So these images were circulated throughout, and in many cases perpetuated ideas of colonialism and a lot of stereotypes of colonized peoples. So again, another good reason why we should have these conversations. The reason why I started with students, starting with political cartoons, is I do think political cartoons is something we tend to do well in historical analysis. It's something that we're familiar with. It's built into a lot of curriculum at the high school level. It's something we continue through with in university. And so we started with something that maybe they're a little bit more familiar with. And I asked them to, okay, this is the political cartoon. This is the caption. What can you tell me about this image? And I think we have the time, so I'm going to ask you all, what can you tell me about this image?
It seems like, well, if I may, it seems like imposing, like something's being imposed, like stepping, like yeah, like
Yep, yep, somebody definitely is stepping. So this is Cecil Rhodes, and what the Rhodes Scholarship is named for. It's crazy because, of course, the Rhodes Scholarship is open to scholars all throughout. Cecil Rhodes, though, was very much a proponent of, we would consider it kind of eugenics. And originally, the Rhodes Scholarship was actually limited to people who were white and citizens of empire. So this is Cecil Rhodes extending his reach across the continent of Africa. And the political cartoon is meant to mimic the Colossus of Rhodes, so from antiquity. So this idea of playing off past knowledge, this idea of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes, this being sort of the more modern Colossus of Cecil Rhodes, and extending the reach of imperialism and colonialism. So this is December 1892. we're starting to see comic books or comic strips are coming up in the 1920s, 1930s, and then by the late 1930s, early 1940s, we have the comic book industry, as we now know it, emerge. Quite importantly, we have the first appearance of Captain America in March 1941. So thinking about the political cartoon we just did, I'm going to ask you to tell me, what do you see? What do you notice about this particular image from March 1941?
Only white men.
Yep.
I find it really notable. I find it really notable the forthrightness and the unambiguity with which Captain America is just punching the crap out of Hitler in
Yes.
in 1941, when there was a significant portion of the American population which supported Hitler, as we now know, the strong support for Nazism in certain quarters of American society.
Okay. Who can tell me what was happening in March 1941 with the US and World War II? So the US had not joined the war effort yet. There was considerable pushback for the US to join the war effort. And of course, they don't join until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So March 1941, the US has not yet joined the war effort. But if you notice, and that was a very good point, Captain America is very enthusiastically punching the face of Hitler. And I'll draw your attention to Hitler is falling backwards. And he is falling backwards to a table. And on the table, there is a map. And that map is a map of the United States. The implication being that if the US doesn't join the war effort, the US will be next. That Hitler will continue to fight unchecked if the US does not join the war effort. So that's a very important point here, is that there's a lot of movement in the image. We have the massive success of Captain America issue 1 juxtaposed with the US not being part of the war effort. But there's another very important storyline to this visual image that, especially if we're viewing this as a historical document, we should consider, which is the creators themselves. So I don't know if folks are familiar with Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who are the creators of Captain America. So Joe Simon and Jack Kirby are Jewish immigrants, the children of Jewish immigrants living in New York City in 1941. So importantly, the US has not yet joined the war effort in March 1941, but people within the Jewish communities, especially the New York Jewish communities, are well aware that at this point, massive numbers of Jewish refugees have been trying to leave Europe. But at that point, there was not support for opening and relaxing immigrant. There's certain restrictions on the number of immigrants that were permitted each year. Quite prominently in 1939, if folks are familiar with the St. Louis, which was a ship of Jewish refugees, more than about 800 or 900 Jewish refugees. They trying to find a safe harbor in Cuba. They actually had purchased visas for Cuba. They were turned away in Cuba. It was massively covered in the New York Times well through June 1939. But the US, importantly, while sort of decrying Cuba's actions, did not offer safe harbor to the Jewish refugees, nor did Canada. So Joe Simon and Jack Kirby aren't just creating something that is at first glance patriotic. They are themselves also creating something that members of a particular community in New York that are well aware of the larger political consequences of not getting involved. Also, Jack Kirby goes on to actually fight Nazis himself during World War II, but that is a subject for another talk. Point being is that there is a lot of visual imagery that is right below the surface in a political cartoon, the same is said to be true for a comic, especially when we historically contextualize it within the period in which it was created. And so this was one of the things we started to do in the class, was start to look for visual elements. We talked about color choice. I mean, obviously Captain America, red, white, and blue. There's a lot of good color choice, but even the different visual elements of the particular cover. Captain America's fist is moving in sort of a semicircle, so our eye naturally is going to travel, especially if we're reading English or other languages read from we start at the right and we kind of continue over. So we're following that Hitler is falling backwards and there is a map of the US right behind him. So the next step was getting the students to read some books, potentially books that they had already read, such as Maus, and sort of more critically examining and talking about particular panels and what elements of the art and the words made these titles so successful. So for folks who have maybe read Maus, this is Art Spiegelman's story of his father living through the Holocaust, living through concentration camps, and also Art Spiegelman himself writing as the child of Holocaust survivors. So it's very much his father and his mother's story for a lot of Maus, especially the first part. So one of the things that Maus does, and one of the things that so many very successful comics do, is they have layered information. So we have the personal, we have larger storylines. We also have panels that are moving between different time periods in history. So we have in the highlighted panel, his father in sort of present day, this is set in the 1970s or 80s, is reflecting on his past and saying that he was very handsome, that people thought he looked like Rudolph Valentino. So we have his father reflecting back, and we have an image of Rudolph Valentino in the chic in the background and other images of his father as a young person. So there's a term in art history called multivalence. Just this idea that we can have on a single page of art, especially when we have multiple panels, we can have multiple things going on at once, that there are different meanings for different audiences, but we might have different periods of time going on as well. This is, of course, so this is the chic that he has going on in the background. One of the things also that Maus does exceptionally well is it has a juxtaposed caption and picture. So just like we saw in political cartoons, so for example, the chapter title for chapter 2 in Maus is The Honeymoon, but we can see the image is not actually a honeymoon. So that kind of juxtaposition, whether or not we realize that we're taking in the fact that this is not the story that we think it's going to be. And that juxtaposition is something that we're really trying to encourage students to, again, take that pause and think about, wait a minute, that's actually not a honeymoon. This is an image of a swastika. There's a lot of fearful people looking up. This is not going to take place exactly like I think it will. We talked a little bit about Persepolis, which again, a lot of people have read, but maybe haven't talked about some of the things that make the title very successful. In Persepolis as well, there is a lot of juxtaposition. So I'm going to call your attention to the image on the far right. We have a smiling family in the middle, but then as our eye travels further out, we have guns pointed at everyone. And the caption is, "The regime had absolute power, and most people in search of a cloud of happiness had forgotten their political conscience." So it is at first glance, and some people have often described Persepolis as being simplistic in terms of the depictions. I would definitely push back against that because there is a lot going on in images that might at first glance seem to have less going on. And a lot of times we're taking in that information. We know that things are not quite as they appear to be. And that's also one of the reasons why this title was so successful. Skip ahead. Okay, I'm just gonna finish up with one of the last things that the students were asked to do. And then if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take any. So the very last thing students were asked to do in terms of final project for this class were putting it all together. So they were asked to draw in this class, which was something that I know was a little bit uncomfortable for many students. They were not graded on their artistic ability. It was more this idea of how do we take a topic? So they all had to pick a historical topic, and then using primary source research, whether it was photographic inspirations, whether it was textual inspirations, they needed to create at least 4 panels on a particular historical topic. So this involved putting into practice different drawing skills, but also thinking critically about when we're working from primary sources, how do we visually depict perhaps a textual-based primary source into a visual depiction? So just some examples. Oh, that did not. Some of my slides got that's fine. We did drawing exercises. So this is a very simple drawing exercise taken from colleagues in graphic medicine who have a whole series called Drawing Together. And it's to really encourage people to push past that reticence of, oh, I don't know how to draw, I'm not an artist, and just think about filling the page and to think again about icons and visual languages. So we started with drawing prompts every week, starting in week 4. And we started with 4 panels, and then students had prompts. We started with very personal prompts because sometimes it's a little bit easier to draw from what we know. And so this particular prompt was, I showed them my drawings as well. So if it was any typical day, I would say something like the highlight of my day was a cup of coffee, and I had drawn a cup of coffee, and this idea of it can just be a cup of coffee with steam coming off of it, that can be a very strong visual image. The best part of my weekend, again, thinking about that concise visual language. Maybe the best part of your weekend was walking the dog, and maybe all you need to include in that particular image was a picture of you and your dog. But then what we also did is look at some examples of artists that were both historians and artists, and how they worked from different primary sources and how they were able to bring textual primary sources into comic creations. So this is Matthew Barrett and Robert Engens Through Their Eyes. It's a graphic history of Hill 70, which is a particular battle fought by Canadians during the First World War. So Matthew Barrett is a historian and also a cartoonist who drew all of the images in this book and was working from primary sources at the Canadian War Museum. So we have here, it's a panel, and you can see there's a lot of interesting choices in terms of close-ups. We have different visual texts, and even here on the right-hand side, we're slowly following the bullet. So it's a way to show that very traumatic impact even of a soldier in war. And as we read the captions, it's actually the soldier talking about the fact that while on the one hand, they felt that they were doing their due duty by participating in the war, it was something that they found very traumatic. And Matthew Barrett, in writing those captions, is actually working from primary sources and working from quotes of a particular infantryman who was a private in World War I. He later went on to be a politician in Canada and actually spoke out against Canada joining the Second World War because of the cost and the toll, especially Canada was still part of the British Empire in World War I, and some areas of Canada lost up to 25% of their male population of a certain age because they were employed in very dangerous casualty-ridden areas during the First World War. So this was a way to contextualize the quotes. So he has direct quotes and then has put them into the different images. And so working from examples like that, I'm just going to show you some student examples and then we will wrap up. So This is one student example who chose to focus on the Irish potato famine. And one of the things I thought was really exceptional about this, this student was very worried about their drawing capabilities, but we also talked about how images can be so successful, even if you're focusing on one particular images. And in this case, they chose one particular scene and repeated the scene through different years, showing the progression of the potato famine and then the impact you can see 2012. They're actually working from archival photos, and this is how they sort of set the scene. And you can see they're making use of the close-up feature. So we have in the upper left-hand corner, a healthy potato. And then in the upper right-hand corner, we can start to see the infestation of the potato. And then by 1846, we can start to see, again with the color choice, that this is now an abandoned farm in 1846. By 2012, we can see that there's some regrowth in the area through the green, but we can see that that particular home has been abandoned and long abandoned. So I thought this was really an effective use of visual imagery and thinking again about that sequencing, what we include, how we include things, and also our color choices. I'm going to show you one more. So students also had the option, if they wanted to, of creating a zine. So a zine would be sort of a do-it-yourself magazine. It could be using cutouts from different magazines, images. You can also make digital zines now. But this, again, this idea of image creation and what will go into a particular image. This student chose to focus on the fruit machine. For folks who aren't aware of this story, this was not a great chapter in Canadian history. So following the 1940 Gouzenko incident, in which we have fears of communist infiltration through North America, the RCMP, so the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, sort of like the intelligence section of Canadian military and police, began a program of systematic purging and in some cases torture of homosexuals from the Canadian Civil Service, fearing them to be a threat to national security. There was never any proof of this. No one was ever any safer, but through the 1950s and 1970s, tens of thousands of qualified intelligence agents and Canadian Civil Service agents were purged from service. So in this case, the student chose their particular color choice very purposefully. You can see a use of pink is the only use throughout. They were also using direct quotes from primary sources. Unfortunately, a professor at Carleton was actually involved in the creation of the fruit machine, which was a test that they would give to homosexuals to determine whether or not they were a threat to the civil service. Obviously, this test was not a real scientific test, and it was something that built on a lot of stereotypes and perceptions of the time. And these are particular statements from the test, and you can see again, including primary source imagery. And then we have quotes, and then even we have images from the RCMP files. The student chose to use pink as their only color throughout the zine because, of course, when we think about the Holocaust and the pink triangle, pink has come to become a very iconic color when talking about queer history. So this, I thought, was also a really effective use of primary sources and thinking about what visually we include, how do we include them. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Amy, so much. This was really, really fascinating. There are many, many things I didn't know about. I'm going to open the room for questions. If anybody has a question, a comment, you can just jump in or write it in the chat. I do have 2 questions, but I'm going to wait and see if anybody has. I don't want to manipulate all the space. Or maybe I will, so somebody will jump in. You mentioned at the beginning and at some points that your own work is about censorship, Amy, and I
Yeah.
was very curious about that. Which kind of censorship are you researching? Not that you give us the whole PhD here, but like what are exactly and how do you say it's coming up again now?
So in the 1950s, comic books were censored on a global scale. It's most talked about in the US. So there was actually the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency held hearings in 1954 talking about the dangers of comic books for young people. And afterwards, there was a massive self-censoring of the comic book industry. They had to change and alter depictions of sex, violence, because there was a very real perception that children would be activated by reading comic books. So it would definitely fall under this idea of a moral panic. We have similar moral panics with going back to the introduction of rock music. Of course, with Sidney Cohen's Folk Devils work, Stuart Hall and other folks, of course, at the Birmingham School talked about the moral panic and fear of mugging with Black youth. In the UK, we have video game panic and like the censorship of video games. So this is all to say this happens in the 1950s, but one of the things my research looks at is this particular moment in censorship was actually larger than most people realize. For example, here in Canada, there was amendments to the criminal code. There was introduction in the UK, it's called Young Persons and the Harmful Publication Act that was introduced in 1955. We have similar censorship that was introduced in Australia. And this is all that to say a lot of what happened around comic books in the 1950s. What I'm looking at is how it introduced standards for, if you will, normalizing certain types of censorship, especially around the umbrella of child saving. And this is actually what we're seeing now. I mean, I know you're based in New York, so it's not as much of a thing, but if you just Google Florida or Texas, many states have introduced banned books lists right now. And these are books that are award-winning books chosen by librarians and teachers that have been pulled off the shelves for fear that, again, these books will have a harmful impact on children. So
you have a comment in the chat. I'm going to read it from Ingrid de la Luz. I think it's great how you are drawing as part of the pedagogical process to learn to read images and the sequence through them. Yeah, I think the whole pedagogical approach you have is really, really great. I have another question, but I'm going to give the opportunity to somebody else to ask or to comment something. So,
Amy, I want to thank you very much for the presentation today. And it reminds me of my misspent youth. You may not know me, but I used to teach at Carleton about 1,000 years ago.
oh my goodness, I think we've just missed each other. Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you wanted to make any kind of distinction. I mean, I'm old enough that I actually, was born a few months after the first comic came out of Captain America. But what we've had as kids, I mean, I had comics around me all the time. And I came from a large family, so the families were passed back and forth amongst various members of the family and friends. So there was a kind of a very well-developed sort of exchange process that took place with them.
Yeah.
But what I was interested in is the distinction that you might want to make between comics and cartoons and or the funnies, as we used to refer to them, that appeared on a serial basis in the newspapers, which were quite common by the 40s and continue, of course, even into today.
So it's a really interesting point. I think my use of comics is sort of very purposeful because one of the things we see through the 50s, and I think something that also hasn't gotten enough attention, is There was a lot of just lumping stuff in and a lot of very arbitrariness. You may not know, Dick Tracy was actually pulled from several Canadian newspapers in the 1950s because it was deemed by some people to be a crime comic. So you see a lot of arbitrariness over definitions. And I think too, especially when we're tracking the lineage of the comic creators themselves, so many of the people that were publishing comic strips in newspapers were also many times creating their own independent graphic novels or indie comics, or also working as graphic designers. It's a very sort of untalked about thing with Art Spiegelman that Art Spiegelman also created the Garbage Pail Kids. So Art Spiegelman is not entirely just a quote unquote serious cartoonist working with memory. He's publishing in a lot of multiple platforms. So but I think what you speak to is also the ubiquitousness of a lot of these visual images. A lot of people, especially in media studies, have done a great job of tracking the fact that you have comics appearing in TV, in movies. Also through the 1960s and 70s, you have a lot of famous like TV shows or bands publishing their own comics as just a promotional thing. I have a bunch of vintage comics from the 60s and 70s that are the Monkees, the Partridge Family, because they had their own comic. So I think it's just trying to introduce the idea that this was a much larger format and that these were images that were so, if you will, saturated in a lot of historical periods that we don't even talk about. So I hope that
And there
answers.
was the attempt to sort of legitimize the comics a little bit more
Yes.
by the classic comics,
Yes. Oh,
which were
entirely.
basically, directed towards a different kind of audience.
Yep. Oh, and I mean, I also have examples. Various religious organizations were vehemently anti-comic, and yet a lot of religious organizations also publish their own comic books. I have examples. The Canadian government, for example, was anti-comic and yet published their own comics. The US military, the same thing. We have people like Will Eisner, famed and considered, if you will, like the father of the graphic novel, who worked for the US military for decades, creating instructional manuals in comic book format. Because one of the things that they found, the military is actually an interesting example because they had done testing with soldiers with text-only manuals or manuals delivered in comic book format. And they found, again, when you're using multimodal materials, people learn better. Because you are activating multiple sensibilities around learning. And so, yeah, that was sort of how Will Eisner stayed afloat through the 1950s, 60s, well through the 70s, was creating instructional manuals for the US military. So more than anything, as I would say I'm very much an advocate for visual history and just hoping that there are larger discussions around visual history, and especially giving students more transferable skills to try to unpack and sort of decode all of those elements of visual history.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, yeah, you have your hand up, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. And Dr. Wright, I wanted to ask your opinion on using comics to do public history with the public. My PhD at the moment, I'm investigating how you can use web comics as a way to draw the public into history production. I did a pilot study and I released a comic based on a newspaper article, and I tested it with two different cohorts, people who found it via Reddit and people who found it via a comic hosting site called Comic Fury. And what was really interesting was that in both cohorts, the expert barrier was broken down. So I knew more about the history than the people reading it. They had all like come across for the first time, but they felt comfortable critiquing not only my drawing and my artwork and my composition, but also my interpretation. So the graphic nature of the delivery of my interpretation of the historical event in question allowed the barrier between expert and layman, academic and non-academic, to be broken down in really interesting ways and quite stinging ways for a couple of people. But it was very, very interesting.
Oh, I think that sounds fantastic, and I'm glad that you're doing that. I mentioned the graphic medicine community. I would highly
Yes.
encourage everybody, like if you're not familiar with them, but just they've done really fantastic work, especially around that. I don't think enough historians would consider graphic medicine part of public history. I'm hoping to change that. They will be included in the special issue that Christine and I are co-editing. Graphic medicine especially did so much frontline work during the early days of COVID, but also this idea of chronicling and documenting. And I do think that we started to see so much graphic history and very much accessible history pop up during the beginning days of COVID. We had a lot of people publishing COVID diaries online. And I think just most people don't realize, I had a whole week on webcomics for the students talking about, especially Instagram. So many comics appear on Instagram, whether we're talking about public health comments, political op-ed pieces, memoir style comics, a lot of graphic journalism. And we've gotten so used to reading a lot of visual graphic history without necessarily calling it that. We're seeing also, there's a lot of comics getting published for larger audiences through The Atlantic. Unfortunately, the Nib, which is one of my favorite graphic history sites, is defunct, but still publishing. And I think, they've done a lot of really great work also pairing that expert with like cartoonists, or in some ways cartoonists who are also expert. You have people like Whit Taylor, who is a public health expert and a cartoonist. And so much of her work, especially she did a great piece on Black maternal health, was so well researched and also so compellingly delivered, because we're talking about delivering information in a way that really cuts through some of the noise. And I think those are the decisions we're making with a lot of graphic history. And I had a bunch of students in the class who were going on to museum studies, and that's why I said to them, whether or not you decide to stick with comics, we're talking about a lot of the same skill set. Like, what decisions are we making in terms of what visual information we include? How do we contextualize it? What conclusions are people walking away with? And I think those are all the discussions that do happen within museum studies, but maybe not that sort of same back and forth of how, by creating these different formats, are we really pushing those boundaries of public history to have more participatory history and include more publics in what we're doing. So
Thank you very much.
yeah, no worries.
There's a question you have in the chat. I'm going to read it from Fernanda Herrera. I have found fascinating your presentation. I imagine your class is fascinating as well. Of your students' works, has a compilation been published as a self-made? Has one of them decided to work their historical research with graphic narrative? Thanks.
So we are hoping to do a bit of a public history showcase for the students this fall. One of my colleagues who was wonderful actually worked as the TA for my course, but is also a public history PhD student. They just taught a class on queer history, and one of the student assignments was to create a zine or a comic. And so we're hoping to do a student showcase of all of the visual work under the umbrella of public history, hopefully in the fall. I have just started to reach out to the students, and that's just some of the examples I shared were students that were okay with their work being shared. I'm excited to share their work, but also want to be really mindful of just making sure that I share student work in a way that students want to be shared. I do think I have feelings on AI and visual imagery, because a lot of visual images that you put up now, you do run the risk potentially of those being aggregated or used in a way that maybe people aren't realizing or that they haven't signed off on. So we're trying to figure out how we can do a student showcase in a way that really showcases the range of public history, visual history options, also in a way that sort of is respectful of the students. So hoping in the fall, and I do hope that whatever we do will also be a digital portfolio of student work. A lot of students are continuing with it. One of the assignments was a reflection exercise to think about the course content and ask them, what were their perceptions around visual history before starting the course, and what were some of the takeaways they had now. And it was really, I guess, rewarding to read. Like, you want the course content to be something that hopefully encourages people to maybe ask some different questions than they asked at the beginning of the course. I don't know if they'll all become diehard comic readers, but again, that's not the goal. I just really wanted them to ask, different questions around visual history. And it did seem like a lot of the students had been prompted to that. And definitely there were a few who wanted to continue with things. Holly's zine that I showed at the end there, I know Holly has continued with zine making and is actually taking my colleague's class now. So it's hopefully other people are thinking, and maybe we'll be better advocates for visual history going forward. So.
Thank you. Are there any, I hope their work will be online. I would love to read it. So are there any questions? I have two questions, but I want to
A small question, perhaps, Amy. What are your thoughts about sort of contemporary, sort of graphic comic memoirs? I'm thinking particularly of Kate Beaton's Ducks and a number of other pieces like that have occurred that are very popular.
Yeah.
And have received awards and various other kinds of things.
So I'm a huge fan of Ducks. I didn't mention this knowing that we have an international audience, but I'm based in Edmonton. So
I'm speaking to you from Cape Breton. So.
Oh my goodness. Okay. That's fantastic. So for folks who, just a very quick, Alberta is the heart of the oil and gas industry in Canada. A lot of people in Canada will move to Alberta for jobs. So Kate Beaton's recent graphic memoir, Ducks, very much documents how she graduated in the Maritimes from Cape Breton and moved to Alberta for work, working in oil and gas, which is primarily a male-dominated profession, and one that is very hard on workers. I love Ducks because one of the things about Ducks, and I mentioned this a little bit in talking about the Graphic History Collective, is there are very few traditional historical books on the shelf that talk about the experience of frontline workers, whether it's working in oil and gas, factory jobs. There's a great graphic memoir out of Japan, which talks about the Fukushima nuclear collapse and a worker who actually worked as part of the cleanup crew. We don't tend to see those histories on traditional historical shelves. And so I think one of the best things about Ducks, besides the fact that I think it's extremely successful as a work, it also creates a history on the shelf for something to which there aren't an abundance of historical texts on the shelf. This also, I'm a huge fan of webcomics. There are some fantastic webcomics out there documenting and chronicling so many historical events in real time that, again, there's not traditional books on the shelf for. So yeah, I love me a memoir like that, because I do think also history is always personal. Whether or not we want to have that discussion, it's always mediated through a personal lens. And I think someone, writing a memoir about their experiences working in an industry that is untalked about is super important and should be considered more. I think sometimes there's still a reticence to accept memoir as historical documents because we talk about this idea of historical objectivity. And as a former librarian who worked in library and archives for a long time, library and archives are not neutral, and they've never been objective. They've had multiple holes in the shelf, and that is something in discussions we need to have more of. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep, you're very welcome.
Okay, you have another
Sure.
question in the chat from Andres Patiño. What do you think about the political implications using illustration to explain history? A very short comment that deserves more elaboration. Sorry.
So it's interesting because this question had actually come up during my candidacy exams, was that somehow visual images are inherently subjective, inherently biased. And I think that that kind of a perception around visual imagery also is if you will, a format hierarchy, and that sees textual only accounts as somehow free from bias and, you know, an objective account of things. And we're always as good as our sources. And a lot of textual accounts are building on sources that have omissions, sources that are built on certain perceptions or particular source base. And I think illustrations can, you know, the same can be said for illustrations. The one thing I will say about illustrations that I find interesting with the scrutiny directed towards them is that I don't think people direct a lot of scrutiny towards photography in the same way that they do illustration, somehow perceiving photography to be a more true account of things. And yet, especially if we're talking about photography of certain time periods chemically, people needed to be very still for a very long time, even for those images to chemically process. And even with that, you have to ask questions of editing and composition, who's included in the image, who's left out, what image choices went into what people are wearing. Because when we create an image, there's a lot of perceptions around this image is sort of standing as a typical image, or thinking about museum exhibits, like this is a typical image of a particular main street town. And what I love about the idea of using illustration is that we are creating the potential for having more discussions around things like historical representation, what we know to be true. And I do think it upsets some folks. I had a few students who it definitely, I think, made them feel uncomfortable, because I do think teaching history in this way tends to challenge history with a capital H, or this idea of total history. I think that that's something, especially working within a Canadian historical program. I mean, I'm a dual citizen between the US and Canada, but I'm doing my PhD here. One of the things we're all supposed to be teaching to is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which says that historical documents should include a variety of sources and really recognize that there's a lot of inequity and systematic racial discrimination that has gone into creation of our museums and archives and sort of traditional ideas of historical documentation. So I do think it takes a little extra work and preparation. You have to have a lot of those conversations, but I think that there's an awful lot that can come out of using a variety of formats in the teaching and understanding of history.
Thank you, Amy. That's a very nice like transition, because my one of the questions I have is kind of a question comment, like things that you make me think about, like about teaching history itself. I teach history at the university here in New York, and after COVID, not only me, many professors, I guess you too, have noticed that the students' span attention is like shorter. Like you have to like more creative with the things you say, assignments, etc. And I was thinking like the use of comic books as you do it, it's very creative. It's a good way to talk to them about discrimination, racism, memory, etc. Things that you need to talk about, but perhaps with different. So this is more like a question comment, also like a question, like for me, like how. So I really enjoyed that. Thank you, thank you. And another question that it's a real question, but maybe it's just of ignorance on my side. I've been noticing recently that there's like using comics and doing comics is trendy. It's like everybody's doing that, but it has a long history. People have been researching this for a long time. So why do you think it's getting so trendy right now?
It's interesting because I do think it's trendy, but I also, one of the things even in preparing this course, and I used to do a lot of this work and still do in my capacity with comics librarianship, is that we're seeing a lot more widespread use of it in terms of maybe more classrooms are using comics, but we're not necessarily seeing an expanded use of titles or an expanded discussion of different comic formats. So I think it was sort of like we went through a period in which, you know, a lot of people in classrooms were doing the flipped classroom model, but not really thinking about why are we doing the flipped classroom model? Like, what is the objective of this? Is to get more student engagement, to have sort of more of the thing of shared authority. So because I see a lot of people, for example, using comics that are not appropriate. Like comics are published for all ages, like all different ages. And I see a lot of people using an adult comic and trying to teach it to students that are not age appropriate. I would not teach Michael Ondaatje to 6th and 7th graders, and people are teaching Maus to 6th and 7th graders. There are other better Holocaust comics, many published actually by the Anne Frank House, that would be appropriate for 6th and 7th graders, not just content-wise, but also there's different languages of comics. Maus makes a lot of use of jumping between the past and present. Again, we wouldn't hand text to a 6th or 7th grader that heavily jump between the past and present, because they're also learning the certain structures of prose at that age. So I think we're seeing more use of comics, but maybe not as much of an thoroughly integrated pedagogical approach yet. I also say that because I know the course I'm teaching is one of only a handful of courses to teach it in this way, which is sort of still surprising to me. And even when I was preparing my syllabus and went to the bookstore, they were like, well, are you going to teach Maus? And I was like, okay. So yeah, I think people are starting to, I mean, we're seeing more use of things like podcasts or audio clips in classrooms. And I think anything like that is very important, because I do think that there is something to be said about trying to recontextualize history for students. And I think using a variety of formats is really important to do that. I've also found really effective. I have like old CBC radio broadcasts. I actually have a CBC radio forum from 1949 in which various community advocates are debating comics. And I found students really respond very well to that, because I think hearing that radio broadcast from 1949, there's something to be said about the particular emotion that is transmitted. And so I think it's about picking sort of the right tool for the right job, you know, and that there are certain things I think that resonate more with students depending on the topic. And but you know, I mean, like a lot of times we talk about pedagogical shifts, but don't always have the time, money, or resources to necessarily make those pedagogical shifts. So yeah.
¿Para qué vas a salir, ¿sabes? Curioso.
Is there a question? Are there any more comments? I had a question in the chat that I'm going to share with you. This meeting was recorded, so after what happens after this is that I process the video and I share it widely in Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, now X. Also, if you don't use social media, you can email me. My email is in the chat, and I can send you a copy of the recording, and Amy will also receive a copy of the video. It would also be uploaded to the Vimeo channel of the International Federation for Public History. This is like a public source if you want, so it's available and easily, and I mean it's easy to find. So Amy, if there are no more questions, comments, doubts, or anything, Amy,
Just a tiny little question. How many students did you have in the class?
I had 65.
65. Oh, wow.
That's a lot.
With a wait list. So I was pretty happy about that. Yeah.
Okay. Amy, thank you very, very much for your presentation. It was awesome, really. And also, at least in a personal level, it gives me a lot to think of. So
I can send you some comics if you want.
Well, I would love to. Thank you for that. I also remember the audience that the Explorers event is done monthly. Next week, we have 2 special events. One is on African digital heritage, and one is in Spanish about the comeback of the right in Latin America. But you're invited, and I hope to see you in next events. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Thanks.